You were a consultant on Inside Out 2. What did it feel like?
I loved working on Inside Out 2. Like, they did the most gorgeous job.
What do you wish principals or superintendents of schools knew?
At which point, usually the kids are like, you don't get it, which is actually not said nicely, but not untrue.
Tame the advice monster, Mom.
Yeah.
Do not go blow up your relationship with your kid over this.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of our brand new podcast. This is the pilot episode. Our podcast is called PrincipalED. It's a little bit of a pun, and we'll see if you can figure it out. We'll talk more about the name maybe in future episodes. But I am so delighted and a little bit intimidated to be welcoming our first guest today. We're starting off really big on the podcast, very on brand for Branksome. I want to welcome the very endeared Dr. Lisa Damour, a friend of Branksome. And Lisa, welcome to the very first episode of the PrincipalED podcast. We're so happy you're here.
I'm hugely honored to get to be with you.
I was so amazed that you would agree to do this. Lisa, you're such an established podcaster. You're the voice of many of my mornings. And so when our team said, hey, Lisa said that she would be more than happy to be on the podcast, I thought they were joking. And I thought, this is incredible. And so I know I sent you an email earlier this week saying, Lisa, I hope that just by osmosis or proximity to you that I'll somehow be able to get through this first episode and have it seem somewhat professional.
Well, all that matters is that you're getting your thinking out into the world. So actually, let's take a beat.
Sure.
Tell me why you wanted to do a podcast. What's it for? What's it about?
Thank you, Lisa. Well, I'm new to Branksome. I've only been here 6 months. And whenever I come into a new school community, it's super important to me to build relationships and try to develop my balcony view of the organization in a way that brings clarity. And that is very difficult to do when you're new, particularly difficult in a community like Branksome that is so vast and so multifaceted. So what I often do are one-on-one 30-minute meetings with every single person, every employee. And so far, I think I'm at 180. Wow. It's been really incredible, but something has really struck me about the people that I've been talking to at Branksome, the stories. One of my questions is, like, tell me all about you. How did you get to Branksome? The stories that people tell, I mean, I've been moved. We've laughed, we've had tears. It's been absolutely incredible to hear the stories of the people that are in our building every day. And I don't think people know the incredible talent that we have here all the time. And so I want to elevate those stories. It'll really be a podcast that will be just lifting the stories and spotlighting the incredible people that we have here at Branksome. One of the top 3 things that our employees have told us is the most unique thing about Branksome is something that I've never heard at any other school, which I found very interesting, which was that the level of expertise of their colleagues was so high that when they came, they really felt compelled to grow as well. And I want to spotlight that. I want to share what makes Branksome so special, which is the people. And I want to be able to talk to people like you who are friends of Branksome and elevate your stories and share your amazing ideas with our community.
Well, welcome to podcasting. I think you're going to love it. I think the world is very lucky to get your podcast.
You are so generous to say that. Let's hope you still feel that way when you see the final cut of this podcast. I want to do a formal introduction of you, which probably is supposed to happen at the beginning.
Quite all right.
But as you can see, we're learning as we go. So I want to introduce this wonderful woman talking to me as Dr. Lisa Damour, internationally recognized educator and New York Times best-selling author, and of course, the host of everyone's favorite podcast, the voice of many of my mornings, Ask Lisa. Lisa has been a beloved visitor to Branksome several times now, and I'm not sure that you need any other introduction, given how widely regarded you are.
That's more than enough.
You've been here so many times, and you are a treasured friend of Branksome.
Well, I love Branksome.
So you are the voice of many of my mornings. I have a couple of podcasts, like a trifecta that I like to go back and forth between. You are one of them, and Adam Grant's podcast is one of them. So imagine my surprise when yesterday I look and I open the podcast And who is the guest for this week? It's Dr. Lisa Damour. So I don't know if you remember like She-Ra and He-Man.
I do
It's a very
remember them.
Canadian kind of
Yeah, no,
context.
we had them in the U.S.
Did
too.
you? Okay,
Yeah.
so, but sometimes She-Ra would be on the He-Man show. It was like a crossover. And I was like, She-Ra's on the He-Man show.
I'm going to tell Adam that.
Oh
that
my
will crack
gosh.
him up.
It was
Yeah.
a moment for me. And
Yeah.
I thought, how on earth is she coming to talk to us at Branksome? We're so lucky. But I would love to talk to you about just this evolution of your work. You're on Adam Grant's podcast. You were a consultant on Inside Out too. What did it feel like? You get these calls to, hey, Lisa, come and talk to Adam Grant. Hey, Lisa, we want you to consult on this incredible Pixar movie. What did that feel like?
I feel incredibly fortunate. I have the best job. I know I do. And I think what has happened is there was only one thing I ever was really interested in, and that's teenagers. It's all I've done for 30 years. I had the benefit of good training on the front end, and then I've just focused on this one area. And then, unfortunately, as a function of the pandemic and other forces, we're now in an adolescent mental health crisis. And so the topic has blown up in its way. And there aren't that many of us who talk and think and write about teenagers. And so I happen to be a person in that space with a track record at the moment when the world suddenly took a stronger interest in that space.
I think that's incredible. And I think about our girls and students here at Branksome, and as they're going out into the world, what an amazing message for them to understand that stay committed to things that you're passionate about and have faith that they will be valued in the world.
That's right. And I would add to that, like, follow your nose. Like, do what you find interesting. So I had a very traditional academic training. I was teed up to be a full-time faculty member and or a full-time clinician. And I was invited to consult at a school in my community, Laurel School, more than 20 years ago, and started to spend time there and just loved it. Loved the people, loved the daily contact with the students, loved getting to see the whole arc of development as I watched girls move through the school, loved getting to see girls through the day, you know, what they look like at 8 a.m. versus 3 p.m.
Yeah.
And in a practice, you only see a little slice of whatever that child chooses to show you that day. And I actually had professional colleagues be like, what are you doing? Like consulting in a closet at a girls' school. Like, that's not really what you're trained for.
Right.
And I'm sort of grateful that I had the moment to just, at that time, think like, but I like this. Like, this is fascinating. Yeah. Like, this is phenomenologically interesting. I can be of use. It's fun. It gives me wonderful colleagues because my writing work, my academic work, my clinical work is actually quite isolating. And so I did it because I wanted to, and I did it because I liked it. It did not actually outwardly, it wasn't shiny in the way that the people who had trained me expected from me. And
substance over flash.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that I want to impress on teenagers. Yeah.
That's a really, really important message. And I just think it's a really great lesson for our girls to be thinking about and hearing about. So
not that the schools aren't themselves fabulous, right? I mean, I don't want to in any way suggest that it was somehow stooping. It's absolutely, I adore schools, and I continue to stay very closely connected to schools. My husband's a teacher.
Oh, is he? What does he teach?
He teaches Latin and Greek at a boys' school in our community.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he's a high school teacher.
Oh, wow. So you really get our work.
I love your work, and I love teachers, and I love educators. But it was hard in a way to come from one form of training and to be trained by people who I had a lot of respect for, who expected certain things of me. And to not do those things, that was hard. In retrospect, I feel like it worked out absolutely beautifully. But I think that was what I would say to young people is, just go with your heart, and and the rest will work itself out.
Yeah, there's so much power in trusting yourself.
Yeah.
And knowing what's working for you. And I love how you've articulated that. I could see that, in a clinical practice, you're getting a slice of a student, but then when you get to see kind of the whole journey, the evolution of a child's day would bring so much clarity to the work that you do.
It does. And I think no one should be treating kids clinically who hasn't spent time in a school. I really started to be really grumpy about that. I was like, how do you get out of graduate school with a PhD in child clinical psych, never having spent time in a school?
Yeah.
Like that really shouldn't happen, but it happens all the time.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of adults could come and get to lunchtime. I think they would be exhausted.
No, they would not make it.
I think they would
not make it.
so much more respect for our kiddos and what they're doing at school.
Yeah, I often say to audiences of adults, like, none of you would make it past third period. Like, you would not.
I think that's very, very true. Well, I'm a super fan of your work, Lisa, which I have said an uncomfortable number of times now, but it's very true. But I think what resonates the most for me is when you say you're worried about teenagers, but how we talk about teenagers. That's something that for me has been weighing on my heart since I started in education. Teenagers have such a bad rap, and I don't believe any of it. I love teenagers. They're one of my favorite groups of kids to work with. I think they are profound and special. But you also say that you're worried about teenagers, and I am too. And I would love to hear, and I'm sure our parents and our educators and anyone listening would love to hear, what worries you the most about how we talk about teenagers, and how do you think that's changed?
So the change question is let's start there, because it really is something I've been thinking about a lot, and actually going back and looking at old texts about adolescence and the stereotyping of adolescence. So one thing that is enduringly true is a sort of negative view of adolescence, a negative view of teenagers. And there's something that we do around teenagers that actually happens, you see this actually occurring across all sorts of prejudices, where you assign problematic traits to that group. And in doing so, make it clear, like, they have those traits and I don't, because, see, they're teenagers and I'm an adult, and that's how I can enforce this prejudice. What's interesting, though, is the traits have changed over time in terms of what we assign to teenagers. So if you look back, we used to see them as, like, just naughty.
Yeah.
Right? They were bad, and they were up to no good, and they were hypersexual, and they were delinquent, right? So the old stereotypes around teenagers were very much around acting out behavior. And, you know, up the establishment and, you know, all of that. The stereotypes have shifted, I would say, in the last 10 years. And the way I've heard it characterized, and these aren't my words, but they're so perfect, is from being afraid of teenagers to being afraid for teenagers. And I think that's really true. So the stereotype has shifted actually to fragile, that we see them as fragile.
Yeah.
And again, I think it's, I guess I'll take fragile over naughty, but I don't think either serves teenagers well. Because they're broad brush stereotypes, which never serve any group well. And so what we're up against right now is a real adolescent mental health crisis that has two forces. One is the acceleration of distress in the pandemic, and then the other undescribed force is the dearth of clinicians who care for teenagers. That is actually a major factor, that very few of us do it, and so we have a lot of kids who aren't getting the care they need.
Right.
So that is very real. But then we also have teenagers acting like teenagers. They have big moods, they have big swings, they are up, they are down. And my worry right now is that we have far too many parents and caregivers who are looking at their 13-year-old daughter having what you and I know to be a totally garden variety meltdown. They are looking at this kid in a fetal position on their kitchen floor. They are looking at 14 headlines a day about an adolescent mental health crisis, and they are terrified.
Yeah.
And so the work right now that I feel so committed to is helping make the distinction between emotional and fragile, because they are far too often equated, and bluntly making the case for distress as natural, important, expectable, not grounds for concern on its own, growth-giving, orienting, and trying to help adults feel less overwhelmed by the normal intensity of adolescent emotionality.
Yeah, and I think what Inside Out too did so well with your great consultancy is helping parents and hopefully kids to understand that distress and anxiety also they can be difficult, and they're also really positive. They can be positive. They have big jobs, important jobs. Well, you're going to be working with our grades 6 to 12 students, and they are really excited that you're going to have some time with them, and so am I. And you're going to be talking with them about coping strategies for how do you handle a bad day? Maybe how do you look at distress and see it for all of its facets? Can you give us an overview of these so that our parents can hear a little bit more about what you'll be saying, and they can follow up at home over dinner and have talks with their kids?
I would love to.
Great.
I would love to. So I'm so excited to meet with your students, and we will play. We will play. Because I love teenagers the most. I think they are so much fun. I have two myself. Well, I have a 21-year-old and a 14-year-old. And so we'll play and we'll imagine together a terrible, terrible day. I'll have them come up with the components of a terrible day. It's always very funny. And then I will say, okay, so now imagine you have a couple hours to yourself. You go home. Let's say, I hope this won't happen, I'm sure it won't happen. Let's say there's a water main break at Branksome tomorrow, so you have to shut school.
Knock on wood.
Knock on wood, it will not happen. I'll tell the students it will not happen. But they don't have to do their homework right away. And I'll say, what will you do to help yourself feel better? Now, I will tell you, I've done this a lot with teenagers. I have never had a kid say, I go home and I practice mindfulness to feel better. They do not volunteer that as something that they turn to. But they tell me all of these other incredible things they do. They go home, as one kid said, and force cuddle the cat. They go home and they raid the refrigerator. They go home and they put themselves back to bed. A lot of just getting back in their cozy beds. They go home and they rewatch TV shows they liked when they were 6 or 7 years old. They start to roll out these incredibly adaptive, quirky at times, and effective coping strategies that bring relief and do no harm, help them feel better, come at no cost. And so we will unpack all of these. I mean, there's going to be so many more. Sometimes they're so funny. One girl said to me, oh, when I've had a terrible day, I go home and I get a piece of paper and I rip it into pieces and then I tape it back together like a puzzle. Right?
Amazing.
And she loves it. And it works, like, what more do I want?
It works for her.
Works for her. And so the take home for the students, and I would say also the take home for the families who are listening, is our kids are actually quite good at coping. We need to accept, and they need to accept, that the distress is a done deal. Right? Life is hard. Being a teenager is really hard. Getting unduly concerned about garden variety distress helps nobody. The focus is entirely on how kids cope and whether they cope in ways that bring relief and do no harm, or cope in ways that bring relief and come at a cost. So your students will, I can tell you already, construct for me a beautiful encyclopedia of all of the things they do that bring relief and do no harm. And I will encourage those, I will endorse those, I will support those. I will tell them, all we ask is just stay away from the things that will hurt you, even while giving relief, whether it's substance, or taking it out on other people, or taking it out on yourself. You will get some short-term relief. Don't go there if you can help it. And this feeds to something I'm thinking about all the time, which is we blow past how well teenagers cope. We ignore the fact that they've got a curated playlist that they turn to that fixes their mood just the way they want. Tell them, get off your phone, get off your phone.
Right.
Try this thing instead. And you and I know, I mean, behavior change is almost impossible. If they're already doing something that works, support, encourage, endorse it, leave it alone.
If it causes no harm.
If it causes no harm and it's
let it
working,
go.
let it go.
Yeah.
Stand back and admire it. As opposed to thinking, you know what you need? You need a yoga class. Which, if the kid wants a yoga class, great. But I think sometimes we miss what they're already doing well.
I think that's a really good point. And I think as parents, we think about what we're reading as, good skills to help with discomfort and distress. And we're trying to impose that on our teens who are like, I got this.
I got it. And
as long as you just let me do it, I've got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's about that trust building.
It is. And I get it as the adult that if you come around the corner and your 17-year-old is watching Octonauts, I don't know if that's big here. It's right now big in the US. All the teenagers are watching Octonauts, which is a little teeny kid program.
Right.
It's weird. I get it. I get it. And a parent might think, like, what is going on?
But it works.
It's beautiful.
And I don't think Octonauts is causing any harm.
It is not. It is definitely
Maybe
not.
I'll try that tonight.
Yeah,
at the end of a long day, just watch Octonauts and see how
Apparently
that
it's
goes.
very, as the teenagers say, it's very vibey.
Oh, very vibey.
Yes.
You've got all the lingo.
I love it.
That must be a great benefit of your job. You have your 14-year-old must think you're very cool.
It's how I torture her. It's how I torture her. I'll say, oh, no cap. And she's like, oh.
She's like, please stop.
Yeah, it's
so
my favorite
cringy.
thing. Yeah, no, mortifying one's adolescent is the best part of middle age. Nobody talks about it.
Oh, it's so fun.
Yes.
I think it's my number one job as a parent to try to embarrass them. Although I've always been my children's principal.
Yes. Oh.
Or whatever the title is internationally, superintendent.
Yeah.
They've never not been in school when I haven't been. So it's my life's work to try to do this. And they're immune to it. I've inoculated them. So good for them. It's going to give them lots of personality when they're older. I really love how you articulate these wonderful things about teenagers and also some of the hard things about parenting teenagers. And I was saying this to you earlier, I really think it's your superpower. There are some such big cerebral things, and you're able to encapsulate them and make them bite-sized and easy to understand, and give parents words for the language that we need. And I really love how you work with this assumption that teens have two sides. It really spoke to me as someone who deeply cares about teenagers and who is around teenagers for the most part of my day. You know, you talk about these two sides, one that's kind of like impulsive and maybe immature at times, that's their job, but then this other side that is, I think people don't always think about, that's really a deep side, a thoughtful side, an insightful side. You said that the side of the teenager you talk to is the side they rise to. Yeah. I loved that, and that sentence plays in my head when I'm talking with my own teen. Can you tell us a little bit more about that in your own very, the way you say it is so much better than how I've articulated it, and I think our parents would really benefit from hearing that.
So, teenagers are provocable. Yeah. You know, I adore them, but I won't whitewash the situation or say they're perfect or easy. That's not true. They are very porous to their environments. And you've been in schools a long time. You know there are kids whose behavior shifts very dramatically class to class based on the adult in the classroom. And sometimes there are adults who don't bring out the best in kids. And sometimes there are adults who are great at bringing out the best in kids. But the same kid, can look very different period to period to period in response to how adults approach them.
So true.
It's so interesting. And I think that it's very unique to adolescents. I think that they are very, very reactive to how they're regarded and how they're treated.
Teenagers know, they have a radar for
this.
this.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do. And they, I think they're highly sensitive to it. And I actually think if we go back to the part about they know there's a bias against them, and I think like any group that deals with prejudice, they become highly sensitive to who holds those prejudices and who's going to treat them in particular ways. And teenagers are sensitive. Like they're actually neurologically hypersensitive. So it's this interesting combination of they've suddenly arrived in this moment developmentally where a lot of the world regards them, you know, in not particularly kind ways, and they are hypersensitive to all input. And so, you know, there's a lot that happens in the wake of that. So they can be provoked. And if they are treated in ways that are disrespectful, or if they're regarded as likely to be problematic, they will meet you right there.
Absolutely.
They will meet you right there.
I've seen it happen time and time again.
And then the same kid, an hour later, who's with an adult who treats them like, I think you're really interesting, and I'm sure you have a lot to say about this, and you're doing this thing that actually I'd really rather you not do, but there's probably a reason, and I'm curious about what's going on here. That kid will act like a 45-year-old.
Absolutely.
With like curiosity and depth of insight beyond what we would ever, you know,
so true,
reasonably expect.
Yeah.
So I think the challenge for adults is when kids are not showing us their best selves, the challenge is to look past it, because it's really hard when they are being, and sometimes they'll be provocative just out of the gate, like the adult has done nothing, but the kid will be provocative. And the moment in my clinical practice where I feel like this lesson really consolidated for me, and I talk about this in Untangled, I had a really fun, really spicy, I think she was 16 or 17-year-old in my practice, who really liked to push the boundaries on the weekends. And she came in, and the story, I've changed all the details to protect my clients, but the story, as I told it in Untangled, is that she had this idea that she was going to go spend the weekend on a houseboat on Lake Erie, with a guy she did not know well, and she was going to tell her parents that she was over at her friend Molly's house. And, cell phone. It's spicy. She's a spicy kid. A lot of fun. So she was showing me the most impulsive, naughty, like bad judgment side.
Right.
And it is so tempting as the adult in that moment to just lean in and be like, do you understand what could go wrong here? Do you see how dangerous this could be? So you just go for that side, right? That you're not being smart. What are you thinking? Any adult who's gone down that road, and which is an easy road to be pulled down, is going to run into a kid who's like, you don't get it. I understand what I'm doing, right? There's no way the kid in that moment is going to be like, actually, I'm really glad you're giving me a lecture, right? Like that's never going to happen.
Yeah.
So I think of myself, I almost sort of like picture it physically. I think of myself being like, okay, this is the face I'm getting. I'm going around the back. And around the back of this kid is good judgment. And so I said to that kid, and I wrote it up, I said, what's a smart girl like you doing making a poem like that? Or something like that.
Interesting.
Where I was sort of like, come on,
Yeah.
this other side of you and I both know this is really not a good idea. But the smart girl like you, who knows this is not a good idea, can I talk to her?
Yeah.
It's a little bit of that. And then usually that kid will come forward and be like, yeah.
I love the visual.
Yeah.
Don't look at the face.
Ignore the eye roll.
It'll be a trigger. But go behind and really.
Yeah.
I love that visual and the way you've said that.
Yeah. And I think most of the time the kid will step up.
Yeah. I think so too. And I think we think about teenagers as not liking adults and not wanting to talk to adults, and I don't find that to be true.
They love adults.
I think
they love them.
Yes.
And they can detect it at 1,000 yards.
And if you're not genuine about it, they can they detect it. It's like their superpower.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about Ennui.
My favorite character.
And mine too, from Ennui is a character for the listeners. If you haven't watched Inside Out 2 yet, you absolutely should. And Ennui is a character. But, our kids, it feels like they suddenly enter their teenage years. But I don't think that's true. I think it's more gradual than we like to think. But of course, their brains it feels very suddenly have developed enough for them to see the world in a vastly new way than they did with their little kid brains. And they develop this beautiful ability to imagine themselves like from the outside. And of course, this comes with lots of new emotions, as we see in Inside Out 2. I thought it was depicted so well, envy, anxiety, embarrassment, and our favorite, Ennui. You've talked about all of these feelings and how isolating that can feel when you're the parent of this teenager. And I think that'll resonate with so many of our listeners who they love their kids madly, and then one day they wake up and they feel like there's a stranger in their house. What advice do you have for those parents who really feel like they're in the thick of it?
Have other sources of self-esteem besides how your kid treats you. Let's just start there, right? If you're right,
critical to survival.
Critical discernment. If you're waiting for your kid to be like, you're amazing, right? You're gonna have
waiting a long time,
hard day. If I had to summarize all of my work, 3 books, 200 podcasts, my newsletter, all of it, I think it could all be summarized as it's not personal. It's not personal.
It's not personal.
It feels personal. It's not personal. And in Untangled, I struck upon a structure that I'm really glad I found of thinking through. It's called, Guiding Teenage Girls Through the 7 Transitions into Adulthood. And there's 7 chapters in the book. They are the 7 transitions. And they are, parting with childhood, joining a new pack, harnessing emotions, contending with adult authority, planning for the future, entering the romantic world, caring for herself. These are the jobs of a teenager. And it's actually the jobs of all teenagers, not just girls. These are the jobs of a teenager. That is a lot of work that has to get done in a very short space of time. And so my goal in setting Untangled up that way was to say, she's not rejecting you. She's parting with childhood, right? She's not freaking out on you. She's trying to harness emotions. She's not rolling her eyes to try to be provocative, though occasionally they are. She's contending with adult authority. She has to figure out how to work with us and our rules, some of which they don't agree with or actually may not even be good ones. Yeah. To try to swivel the lens toward, look at all this stuff this kid's got to sort out in a very short period of time. Oh, you will get pulled in and you will get pushed out, but it's not personal.
Yeah.
She's on her own journey here, and you are along for the ride.
It's not about you.
It's not about you. And I think that if there's any contribution I can make, that is the contribution I would want to make, which is to recognize adolescence is wildly stressful because it involves so much change. And it's stressful for the kid and everyone around her.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean she's trying to hurt us. It doesn't mean she doesn't love us. And I think the less personal it can all feel to the adult, usually it goes way better.
I think that's wonderful advice. And I think we should all have a sticky note on our bathroom mirror. It's not personal, and it's not all about me.
It's not about you. It's not about you.
I love the quote. We hear it all the time. Little kids, little problems. Big kids, big problems. And I know I feel this way. I'm sure you feel this way about your own girls. But I think we all kind of long for that time where it felt like you could just fix any problem with like a cuddle, a Band-Aid, like an applesauce pouch. You're good. Everything's
that triumvirate of fixing things, right?
It was fantastic.
Yeah.
It was like, and we're done. Fantastic. I feel like a great parent. But then you've got these big kid problems. And it can feel so scary for our parents, and for a lot of reasons. Either we don't really know how to talk to these new kids that are suddenly in our house about these problems. The applesauce pouch doesn't work. We don't know how to change maybe our communication based on this new way of communicating with our child. And maybe they bring up past scars that we have had or we've experienced in our teenage lives. So I think we are so uncomfortable with our teens' discomfort because we love them so much. Yeah. So it's a good reason, but it's hard to navigate that. We just want everything to be okay. How can you coach us on this? How can we reframe this as parents of teens?
We could do 4 hours on this question.
Let's go.
Let's go. Okay, so let me just first set the scene of when this usually goes down.
Yeah.
And why it's so hard. So at least in my experience, as a parent, I have worked all day. It is 5 or 6 or 7 p.m. I am done. I am very tired.
Yeah.
I am aware of the television show I want to go watch. And right now we're stuck on All Creatures Great and Small, which is adorable.
Fantastic.
But it could equally be Formula One. We were deep into that, right? I mean, like, I know where my day is ending, and I can see it, and I'm trying to get there.
You've been waiting all day for it.
All day, and then I'm going to go to bed.
Yeah.
And then a daughter finds me and is having what feels to her like a crisis.
All the feelings.
Whether it's academic or a friend or future or worries or romantic, who knows?
Yeah.
But because she is a teenager, and she has held it together like a champ all day. Schools get the absolute best of our kids.
Yeah.
It is now, she's exhausted. She is falling apart. Okay, Grace, I'm going to be really honest. I'm going to tell you something I wish weren't true.
Okay.
I very rarely greet this happily. I very rarely greet this moment like, this is a wonderful time to connect with my child. I'm so glad she's talking to me about her feelings.
I hope there are no parents out there that consistently greet it that way.
Yeah, no.
Yeah. If they say they do, they're lying.
They're lying. Usually I'm like, oh, come on.
Not now.
Not right now. Like,
Not
really?
the garbage dump right now.
Oh, come on, really? Really?
Yeah.
And I'm not proud of that, but that is the truth. And I think if it's true for me, when I have actually 30 years of training and experience dealing with this moment, it's got to be true for other families.
Absolutely.
And so I think that part of why these moments are so hard is they catch us at terrible times. They catch us at absolutely terrible times. Yeah. And so then we can be very quick to be like, why are you doing this? And how do I get it to stop?
Right.
Which does not make it better. Does not make it better. So I think that that's one piece of it, is just the sheer structure of how these events unfold in family life can make it hard. The other thing that I think, I'm going to say a whole bunch of bad news and then some really great news. Okay.
Okay, good. We'll hold on for the ride.
Hold on for the ride. Okay, so the bad news is stuff with teenagers gets way more complicated.
Yeah.
Way more complicated, right? It's not, Timmy took my truck, right?
Yeah.
It is, I can't find a place to sit in the lunchroom.
Yeah.
And when I think about the lunchroom moment, and when I picture walking into like a 7th grade lunchroom, or as you say in Canada, grade 7 lunchroom, I want to translate, so don't get it, lose anything.
So kind.
You're welcome, you're welcome. What I picture is there is activity occurring in that lunchroom in probably 40 dimensions. Like the subtleties of what is happening, it's a 40-dimension chess game.
Yeah.
As adults, we may perceive 2 or 3 of these dimensions. I think the kids themselves are at some level probably aware of most of the dimensions, but can articulate very few.
Mm-hmm.
So wildly complex situations. Then the kid comes home and says, there's nowhere for me to sit at lunch. And the well-meaning parent is like, well, you know what you should do. Okay, so now the well-meaning parent is operating with like 1 or 2-dimensional understanding, which may not map meaningfully at all onto the realities. The other thing that's really tricky is the kid who goes to school is not the kid we see at home.
Yeah.
Identity is very, very fluid for all of us, and I think especially for teenagers. So we think we know the kid who's walking in that lunchroom. You don't actually know that much about the kid who's walking in that lunchroom. It's a different kid, right? This is why it's so weird
true.
Sometimes when your folks come to a thing at your work, right?
Yeah.
Because you're like, oh, that's not me.
My 2 worlds have
My
come
worlds
together.
have come together. So we lovingly and ham-handedly try to help out. At which point, usually the kids are like, you don't get it, which is actually not said nicely, but not untrue.
Tame the advice monster, Mom.
Yeah, you don't get it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's the bad news. They are bringing wildly complex situations. Our ability to guide them, I would say, is extremely limited, extremely limited. Here's the good news. They are smarter than they have ever been. I think they can perceive these 40 dimensions. They also know who they are at school, and they can imagine possibilities that we would never dream of.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that the better way to enter those moments is, first of all, wildly humble, right? We do not get it. We do not know. And again, I will say that as someone who, this is my whole job and my whole career and my whole life. I sort of feel like 7th grade lunchroom, like I'm seeing next to nothing of what's actually happening in that space, even if I'm in it. Mm-hmm. Then I think we put a lot of faith in our kids. We let them talk and talk and talk about what it is that's wrong. And then we say something like, this sounds incredibly hard. I'm sure there's a huge amount of this that I can't really wrap my hands around because I'm not there and I'm not you. But you're there. And you know what the variables are, some of which you're conscious of, some of which you might not even be. What do you think might work? What do you want to try? Or once you get into it, do you think if you, having laid it out a little bit for the both of us, some new possibilities might open up?
I think that's wonderful advice. And, staying humble, I think is really important. And I think as parents, we think back to our own time at that age and what it felt like. And we forget that it's so different now. And it's so complex.
Yeah.
I love that advice of staying humble and having faith in your kid.
She gets it.
I love that.
Whether she knows it or not, she actually knows quite a bit.
Yeah.
So I think it's actually speaking to that in her.
And helping her to build her own strength. And as we started the podcast with, trusting herself and what she knows is best for her. I think that's great. And my next question was actually kind of about taming the advice monster and that urge to fix the problem when they come to us in distress. And I know I've fallen into that. I want to fix it. And sometimes they don't need us to fix it. Sometimes they really actually would prefer that we don't even talk about how to fix it. How would you coach parents to respond when their kids come to them in this emotional distress, which you kind of talked about earlier, over a situation with friends or an incident at school, when it's our desire just to be the fixer?
Yeah.
What should we do in those moments?
Okay, so back to me trying to watch my TV shows. I think usually the reason I'm giving advice is to try to end this. Yeah. Right? Oh, you have a problem? I'm going to give you an answer.
Quick fix.
So that I can carry on with what I was going to do. I mean, again, not proud, but that's the truth of my family. First of all, we have research, actually, I've done some of this research showing they don't want advice. Yeah. That's not what they're coming for. They're coming for a sounding board. They're coming almost always just for validation. Right. They just need to lay it out. They need someone to hear it. often kids are being really good and discreet and not talking about peers with other peers, unloading it at home in an effort to sort of get some relief without actually stirring the pot at school, right? I mean, that's often what's driving it. So I think there's a few things I can offer. One is, I think there's some really handy phrases. I actually just did a video for UNICEF I'll share with you where I was like, 3 handy phrases that all parents need. And so one is, do you want my help or do you just need to vent?
Love it.
That can usually help us. That's not mine. That's been around forever. But that can usually help us pull it together.
How do I frame this? Tell me how to frame it.
Yeah, just what are you looking for here? Another is actually just straight up validation. Of course you're upset. Anyone would be upset based on what you're describing. Kids want that. They're not sure if they're having the right reaction because it's pretty potent. Right. And so for an adult to be like, well, yeah, that sounds bad. They're like, thank you. That's all I came for. My favorite, this got me through 2 teenagers. Is there anything I can do that won't make it worse? Because that usually,
I love that.
It's really generous and also very humble, right? Chances are anything I try to come up with is just going to antagonize you. Is there anything I can do that won't make it worse, right? And kids really appreciate that one. So that's the quick and dirty on it.
Right.
The other thing I would say, and I think about this a lot, there's a huge amount of help we can offer without fixing. I think we think fixing is the help. Listening is help. Validating is help. Empathy is help. Comfort. I'm like, that sounds terrible. Do you want your favorite soup? Right?
Do you want octonauts? Is that what it's called?
Octonauts. Yeah, you want that. Well, that's helping.
Yeah.
And I think the more that we can move away from the idea that to help is to fix the problem, to the idea that to help is to support your kid as she navigates it and finds her way through.
Yeah. I've definitely been in those moments where I've been like, oh, of course it's right before bedtime. It's always when it comes. Yeah. And how lucky am I that they will come and they'll talk to me and I might be the garbage kind of receptacle that day of everything that's balled up throughout the day. And you said something that I loved about these conversations. You said, they're going to give us kind of all this stored up like garbage they've had throughout the day. It's not our job to sift through it. I think you said we just tie it up and
get rid of it.
Get rid of it.
Yep.
Yeah, and I loved that. I want to talk a little bit about your early life and some of your influences. My children are third culture kids. They were born in China, then they spent time in Germany and Brazil, and all of the children that I've had the opportunity to care for in my career until Branksome have been mostly third culture kids, and you are too. So growing up, such diverse locations, Denver, London, Chicago. How did those early experiences with the world influence your perspective on adolescent development?
So all of that went down. I was born in Denver. We moved to London when I was 6. We moved to Chicago when I was 7. So it was quick overseas. And then back to Denver when I was 10. So a lot of transitions. And the back to Denver, we moved to a different part of town. It was starting over again.
Like a new city.
A new city. And so I had a lot of disruption and a lot of transition by the time I was 10 years old.
Right.
My folks, and my mother in particular, she's very adaptable. Like she finds the good in things. And I think she really impressed that upon me.
Right.
And so I think as a function of all that early disruption, which I don't know necessarily, it wasn't in many ways great, that it was, I think it would have been nicer in some ways to have a steadier experience, has made me very adaptable to conditions. Right. Just because you have to. I mean, if you're changing that much, you just have to become adaptable. And I think adaptability is probably one of the key things that teenagers need in order to thrive over time. And I think about, this moment we are in historically when there's a lot of anxiety about what's ahead and where things are going. And I think about, well, okay, so we don't really know. What can we do for our kids right now? So one I would say is help them be adaptable. Help them withstand change and tolerate change and expect change. Yeah. And then I would actually say the other would be to be emotionally durable, right? To know that they can get upset, but that doesn't mean it's going to harm them. That they can withstand distress. I think these are the things we can cultivate in adolescence that set kids up for whatever comes.
I think so too. And we've been talking a lot about that as a school, about what do our girls and students need? What do they need? What are the skills that we really have to be doubling down on? And that emotional durability, that's something we've been talking about. I think our girls have it. I think our girls and students are still exploring what are the tools that they need to strengthen that. But I think that's so true, and it's such an important part of what we have to do in schools. And I think sometimes non-educators look at schools and remember what schools were like when they were growing up, which is like math class, science class, health class, social studies. But it's so much more than that. It has to be so much more than that. So I love, it's very affirming.
Good.
To hear that those are some of the things we need to be thinking about with kids. I thought it was amazing that you worked at the Child Study Center at Yale after earning your undergraduate degree. What an amazing opportunity. And also what an incredible specialization early in your career. How did that shape your path going forward?
So I actually, and I talk about this in Untangled, I decided at 7 to be a psychologist. It was when we were living in London. We had a family friend who was training with Anna Freud, who was Sigmund Freud's daughter and who worked out child and adolescent theory. And
incredible.
I used to spend a lot of time with her, and I was totally taken with what she was doing. And I think it probably wasn't an accident that this was in the wake of a lot of disruption in my own life, that as a kid I was like, oh, check it out, Inner Lives of Children. Let's talk more.
This is of interest to me.
This is fascinating. So I went to college knowing I would be a psychologist. I was very fortunate to get into Yale. I would not get in now. The admissions rates have changed so much, and I know who I was in high school. And
I think you would get in now, Lisa.
Well, I mean,
I have a feeling.
Well, at 54 with 3 books, I'd probably get in. But I don't think me at 17 would have gotten in. I know that. But I started working for the Yale Child Study Center when I was a sophomore. And I went to college young. I went to college at 17. So I was 19 years old when I started working for the Yale Child Study Center. And, it's one of those things where you just don't know what you're getting till you leave. And so I was working on research projects. I worked for them in the summers and then through the school year. And then I was hired when I graduated onto a different research team. And then when I went to graduate school at the University of Michigan, they're assigning us all these papers. It's by all the people I've been up down the halls with, for the last 5 years at Yale. So I got really fortunate and still draw on things I learned at 19, 20, 21 when I was working there as a research grunt, really. But I had exposure to incredible clinicians and incredible thinkers. And mostly I just feel like I've just done one thing, and I've just gotten to do it in some really great places, and I've benefited from that.
What an incredible formative experience that must have been. Mentorship and sponsorship are really important to me personally. They're things that I've greatly benefited from. They're things that I try to put out into my own professional work. And thinking about these incredible experiences that you've had, is there a mentor or a sponsor that really had impact on you?
I've been really fortunate and had several people I could look to for support and guidance. I would say the person who comes to mind is actually the person to whom Untangled is dedicated, a psychologist named Jim Hansel. So when I was in graduate school at University of Michigan, he was on the faculty. I'm speaking about him in past tense because he died young. He died at 57. And so he was one of my supervisors. He was one of the people who trained me. And the best of the best, just a wonderful human being, absolutely fantastic, brilliant. And it sort of, I can't believe we did this. When I was a graduate student, one of my dearest friends, she remains a dear friend, and I, we were we should write a book about college teaching. Because we didn't know what we were doing when we were thrown in as TAs. So she and I, Ann Curzan is her name, we wrote, while we were writing our dissertations, we also on the side wrote a book.
In all of your spare time.
I don't know what we were thinking. Called First Day to Final Grade, A Graduate Student's Guide to Teaching. The 4th edition is about to come out from the University of Michigan Press. This book has had a very happy little life.
Oh, wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, it's sort of this, in a past life, this was something I was doing. So Jim, while I was working on this book, and then I did my postdoc at Michigan, had started talking to college textbook companies about writing a new textbook in abnormal psychology. And then he realized the scope of the work involved. And then he saw that I'd just done this book, and he's like, hey, do you want to co-author a textbook in abnormal psych? which I was like, sure, okay.
That's amazing.
It is. It's not fun to write textbooks, I will say.
It doesn't sound fun.
It's pretty tedious. So Jim and I worked together as co-authors on 2 editions of a college textbook in abnormal psychology that came out. That he had that kind of faith in me. I mean, like I was 27 years old, probably 28 or 29 when we signed the contract. That he guided me and took me on into that role, that I got to learn alongside him. And then I would go to him for guidance because I, especially trying to think about, like, I want to have a family and I have career ambitions. And I remember we were sitting in one of my supervisory sessions and it kind of turned to like thinking about the future for me. And I was like, how am I going to do all this?
Yeah.
Like, how am I going to handle this? And he said, just get as far as you can, as fast as you can.
Wow, that's great advice.
It was really helpful. And I do look back, and I don't, I was lucky that I knew what I wanted to do, because I had my PhD by 27. And that, I got to do all of that before I had kids, when I could just be focused entirely on what I was doing, has set me up. Now, this is pretty unusual. Not everybody knows what they want to do and then digs in so young and early. It worked really well for me. And so Jim, then he died of a blood disorder at 57, and it was just devastating. Like,
he sounds like an incredible person.
Yeah.
And what a beautiful example of mentorship and sponsorship.
Yeah.
And I'm so happy that you had that experience.
Yeah.
And I wish it for all of our girls and students. And I think it's something that is not as pronounced with upcoming females in certain industries. Mm-hmm. I would guess in academia that would be pretty incredible that you had this wonderful person who sponsored you and mentored you in this way. And we talk a lot about glass ceiling, and I don't think we talk enough about sticky floor. How we need someone to pull us up. Yep. We need someone who believes in us, who will notice something in us, see something in us, and say, hey, I've got you. I want to make sure that you get to reach your aspirations, and in turn that impacts them well. Yeah. I think that's pretty incredible. And how wonderful that you dedicated your book to him.
Yeah.
Oh. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing this wonderful story of sponsorship and mentorship. I think that's pretty incredible. You have described your work as bridging research, clinical practice, and real-world advice. And did you have any role models for how to do that? Because I think it was so interesting to me is you've got this incredible past life, current life as well, that was deeply entrenched in academia, but you've been able to bridge that in a way that I think is very unique. So how did this happen, and who were your role models to do that?
So I would say probably the person out there whose work I was looking to was actually Michael Thompson.
I've heard him speak. Very
smart clinician. Yeah. Very steeped in good clinical work, largely around boys. He has been his center. But when I was thinking about writing Untangled, I looked at his book as an example of something that held water clinically, and yet was really effectively translated for broad audiences. In terms of how I developed a skill set, I actually sometimes think, so we live in suburbs of Cleveland. We live in Shaker Heights, where there's like next to no traffic and everything's really close to each other. And so for a lot of my early career, so we moved to Shaker Heights about 25 years ago. I started a practice. I was taking care of a lot of the teenagers. And then Laurel asked if I could consult a day or two a week. So I started consulting at Laurel. And my practice and Laurel are a 5-minute drive apart, and they're both about 7 or 8 minutes from my house. I was teaching at John Carroll University, which is a lovely Jesuit college, regional college. I was teaching undergraduate courses in psychology and then graduate courses. And a lot of that is translational, that you're trying to take the field and make it really exciting for sophomores, right? And so that's a skill set.
Absolutely.
And so I would just go between these spaces. I go home, practice, John Carroll, Laurel, and in all of those places, I was doing translational work, right? In your practice, you're trying to help people understand, but you have to use plain language. I was doing a lot of parent education at Laurel, so I had all of this information about child development, adolescent development, but I'm speaking to families there. Right. speaking to families, you can see when you've lost people, you can see when you're on track, so it helps with the skill set. Going over to John Carroll, same thing with sophomores. I can see when they've glazed over. I can see when I've got them again. And so I think moving through those spaces and the fact that out of the sheer convenience of life in Shaker Heights, I could literally do all 3 jobs on a given day, like the same day I could do those jobs. And I did have moments where I thought, gosh, if I'd landed in Manhattan, I'd have to choose. I could only be at a university, or I could only, like, would, the convenience of getting from place to place would have been a barrier.
And that transfer learning would not be able to happen.
No,
You'd be
exactly.
siloed.
You'd be very siloed. So I think, like, the happy accident of, like, living in the Cleveland suburbs and having a training that let me work in these different domains, letting, you know, the families at Laurel School who put up with me while I was learning and learning how to talk and think about teenagers, and I could see what was useful to them, and I could see where, you know, their brows would furrow when I was on the wrong path. I think that all, and then I'd been writing, you know, I'd been writing college stuff, and so then I was practicing, and I finally got to the place of, like, why isn't there a book about typical development in girls, right? There's only books about when things have gone terribly wrong, which are important, but, like, we also need just generic books. So I wrote Untangled.
That's how it was born.
Yeah. The book I needed did not exist.
That's what they say, right?
Yeah.
Write the book that you wish you could read.
So
And you did it.
That's how Untangled came to be.
Well, that's amazing. And an incredible segue to the next question, which is, I mean, you have written not 1, not 2, but 3 best-selling books. I mean, you're living the dream, Lisa. Yeah. Great job. Untangled, The Emotional Lives of Teenagers and Under Pressure, all tackle the complexity of adolescent girls with such compassion and such clarity. I just think it's incredible. How have your insights evolved throughout this work? And what has maybe changed for you that maybe at the beginning you didn't know to be true and has changed over time?
I think it's just become in some ways simpler. I think the word humble just keeps coming to mind. I think I've really just become so much more respectful of how much information teenagers are holding that adults don't have access to. And so then when we wade in with our guidance, I think we're not always helpful in the ways we need to be. I think my empathy for all parties has grown over time. I think I've really come to appreciate how much we ask of teenagers and how hard it is to be a teenager. And I've really come to appreciate, especially at this moment in time, how anxious parents are. Yeah. I think the world is making teenagers feel very scary for adults. Not scared of, but scared for. I hate that for parents. Yeah. I think kids are fun, should be fun. This shouldn't feel so fragile as I think it does sometimes. In terms of what I've changed my mind about, I'm relieved to say there's nothing I've gone back in what I've written and thought, like, I changed my mind, like, wholeheartedly changed my mind. A place, and this gets to the humility and working harder to meet kids where they are. I used to be very, very, very rigid about kids not having any technology in their bedrooms overnight. And I stand by the idea that it's a great place to start. Right. Right. If you, and I have done that with both of my daughters. And I'm actually very, very rigid about it in my house. That
a safe place to begin.
Just like, like, it just doesn't go in your bedroom. And I think if you start there, it's actually not that hard to stay there. I think that becomes established, and it's pretty easy to enforce, especially if you also don't take your tech into your room. I have encountered plenty of families where they're like, yeah, that ship sailed. Right? Like that
I didn't start there, and I can't walk it back.
I can't walk it back. And I was, I think, ungenerous about that. I think I was like, well, yes, you can, right? Like, and this is a fight worth having. But I actually have softened on this and changed my mind. And here's where I'm at with it. The single most powerful force for adolescent mental health is strong relationships with caring adults. Yeah. And if your kid has her tech in her room and it is not messing with her sleep, she deals with it like, you know, a 50-year-old would. You know, she
puts it on airplane mode.
Do not disturb, whatever. It's her little music, it's her little alarm, whatever. If it is not a problem, do not go blow up your relationship with your kid over this. Yeah. And so that's a place where I'd like to take back some of my rigidity in the past about it. And then I've gotten even more flexible to the point of, if you think it's a problem, I actually think you could say to most kids, I think this is a problem. If it stays a problem, it's coming out.
Yeah.
And I think most kids would be like, you got it.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I will.
Problem solved.
Problem solved.
Yeah.
The relationship is our number one asset. I would almost go so far as to say our only asset.
Yeah.
And I think you protect it while protecting your kid. And I worry about one-size-fits-all rigid guidance that threatens the relationships we have with our kids. They are smart. We can tell them what our worries are. We can tell them what we think they need to fix. I think a lot of kids will get it right on that alone.
And I think a lot of our listeners might be surprised by that. They might be surprised that number one is strong, caring relationships with adults in their lives. We have this misconception about teenagers that it's all about their friends. And I've heard you say that, and it brought me a lot of relief, actually, to know that. I think our listeners will think that as well. We hear it all the time. It's not about parents anymore, it's all about friends, and that's not necessarily true.
Oh, it's not necessarily true, but it's interesting because it's also not untrue. I mean, it's a sort of a funny thing. And one of my favorite, I loved working on Inside Out too. Like, they did the most gorgeous job. And one of my favorite things, it's a quick little joke right at the beginning, but such a gift to families, where they're surveying the islands from the first movie.
The family one is this big.
Exactly. And somebody goes,
And it's gray.
What happened to Family Island, right? And it's receded to the back, and it's all drab, and like Riley is standing apart from her parents. And Friendship Island is this giant amusement park that has taken center stage.
I loved that part.
I actually think that is such a gift to families, because again, it's like, it's not personal. It's not personal. We can put it on the screen. We can show it to the whole wide world. You will recede to the background. Friendship Island will take over. So that is true. But in terms of mental health, and it's funny you mentioned my conversation with Adam Grant, because he asked the same question, and I remember how I answered it. I'm going to say it again here. I'm like, Adam, picture a teenager who is not connected to any adults.
Yeah.
Right? Picture a teenager whose world is entirely peer and there's no meaningful adult. Ideal if it's at home, but like, that doesn't always happen. A teacher, a coach, or whatever. Like, that kid is in trouble.
Yeah.
Like, we know that instinctively. What we want is, they love their friends, they want to be with their friends, and then they can come home and they know they've got an adult if they need one.
So Lisa, with all of your lived experience and all of your incredible work around teenagers, if you could go back in time, just jump in the DeLorean and head back and give yourself one piece of advice to your teen self, what would it be?
I actually think it's going to be what we've talked about, trust yourself.
Yeah.
Trust yourself. And I'll tell you, actually, to just thicken it a little bit, Annie Murphy-Paul is a friend and colleague of mine who's a science writer. And she wrote a book recently called The Extended Mind, and it's about just how our brains work. And it's a brilliant and very technical book. In it, she talks about gut feelings and the science behind gut feelings. And what she articulates is that we're collecting more data all the time than we know. And we can't always consciously rifle through it. But when you have a gut feeling, the way she says it is, it's all that data pulling on your sleeve saying, we've been here before. We've been here before.
Wow.
And so since I read that, 2 or 3 years ago, I have now become completely, I ride on gut feeling. Like, I will be in meetings, I'll be like, yeah, I'm not doing that. I can't tell you why, but I'm not.
Yeah.
And
knows a complete sentence there.
Yeah.
And
totally
I just
comfortable
feel it.
with that. And so, I think the question I have is, do you have to be 54, to have enough accrued experience that you can really, really ride on it? But I actually think, you know what? Our girls are smart.
Yeah.
They've picked up a lot of data. And so I think increasingly to say to them, what is your gut telling you? Because that's actually to be taken very seriously.
That is a wow. I think that's a really important one. And I wish I could go back and tell myself that as well. Might have helped me through a few of those teenage bumps along the way. I have this incredible opportunity and this incredible job. I don't see it as a job. I see it as my life's calling, my life's work, a lifestyle. And it means so much to me. And now I'm here at Branksome Hall. This is the only school that I would have come back to Canada for. I've been living internationally for almost 18 years and leading internationally. But Branksome Hall, it was the school. So now that I'm here, it's so important to me to do this to the most excellent ability that I can. What advice do you have for me what do you wish principals or superintendents of schools knew when it comes to teen girls, and what advice might you have for me as I keep going on this amazing journey that I've started here at Branksome?
Well, I think Branksome's very lucky to have you.
Well, that's kind.
I think the thing I learned at Laurel is check everything with the girls.
Yeah.
So before I would come up with a program, and then I'd be like, I'd go find myself a bunch of junior girls, grade 11s. I think junior girls
So special.
are so special. Senior girls are fabulous. They do not work for us anymore. Junior girls,
Their mind's on the next thing.
they're off. Junior girls are still there for us. And so I made a habit when I was trying to sort something out, or when I had an idea of something I wanted to do, I would go find myself a pack and I'd be like, hey, what do y'all think of this? Or I remember when, worries were really starting to happen around social media, I would go to them and be like, how worried should the adults be? They're like, it's not us, it's the 7th graders, right? I mean,
I love that.
They, if you ask them a straight question, they will give you a straight answer. And it makes me bananas when I see schools come up with like these elaborate programs that they like drop on kids. I'm like, oh man, like you're lucky if you get that right at all. Whereas if you had literally spent 10 to 15 minutes running that by the kids and told them what your outcomes were and what your aims were, and were earnest and honest about your wish for their input, they would have made that probably 14 times more effective than what you came up with on your own.
That is such good advice. I absolutely agree with you. And, our seniors, our grads, we call them GYs, our graduating year students. Our GYs have been so embracing and welcoming of me to this community. And our grade 11s, or in US terms, our juniors. So absolutely, I should lean on them more.
Yeah,
they're incredible, intelligent, thoughtful.
Check all your thinking with them.
Yeah, that's such good advice, Lisa. I'm going to take that with me. Well, now we have our closing, which we're testing out. It's kind of like rapid fire questions.
Okay.
So no pressure, but you have only 2 seconds to answer each question or we evict you from the podcast. No, I'm just kidding. So we're going to start a Branksome playlist on Spotify.
Oh, okay.
We're hoping. We'll see how this goes. But what is one song that you play on repeat, Lisa?
Oh, I am stuck right now on Beyonce's, the whole album, Cowboy Carter. But what's the one? I'm sure you know.
Oh, Texas Hold'em?
Yep.
Yeah.
Can't stop listening to it.
Oh, I love it. That's great.
Yeah.
What is a guilty pleasure that you're never going to give it up?
I really love TV. And TV's so good now.
Me too.
It's so good.
So good.
It's so good. We are always deep into something.
Me too, and I
Yeah.
love that because I
Yeah.
think people want me to say that I'm just reading books all the time, but I'm not.
no.
I'm watching TV.
No, watching a lot. Yeah.
If you could switch lives with one person for a day, who would it be?
Okay, I think you'll be surprised. I would switch with an 8th grade boy.
Tell me more.
I don't understand what their worlds are like.
Yeah.
I really don't know what it's like to be them.
Yeah.
I try to figure it out. I'm thinking about it a lot.
Right.
I'm worried about boys.
Yeah. Me too.
We need to do right by them.
Mm-hmm.
They are fairly opaque to me. And so I would like a chance to be one.
I think, you know what? It doesn't actually surprise me, I guess, because you've had such incredible work with teenage girls that teenage boys might be a bit of a question mark. Yeah, that's great. Best piece of advice, the best piece of advice you've ever received?
I think it was from Jim about get as far as you can, as fast as you can. That was professional advice.
Yeah.
I think there's something else, though, too. Like, I grew up in Denver, which was a really small town when I grew up there. It's now become like Los Angeles, but it was tiny. When I left to go to college, we only had a single department store in town. It wasn't even a national chain. It was like a really small Midwestern town. And I think there's something around a small town growing up in one, you sort of assume like you're going to know these people forever. Like you don't burn bridges, you don't leave bodies in your wake. You're good to people.
Yeah.
And I think I was raised with that guidance, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because like you will stay in community with people. And I feel like that's good advice. Like, be good to people.
Yeah.
Because it's the right thing to do, and because you're gonna keep they will come back around into your life. And I feel like that has been true. Like there's been so many overlaying, returns of people from various points in my life. And I know I haven't always done it right, and I know I'm sure I've hurt people, but I think for the most part I've been able to fall back on I think generally I've tried to be a nice person, and I think that served me well over time.
I think that's great advice. And Lisa, what do you want to be remembered for? It's our last question.
Just being useful.
Being useful. I love that. Lisa, it has been such a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for making our first episode feel so easy and so much fun. And it was far less intimidating than I thought it was going to be. You are a blast. I could talk to you all day.
This was really fun.
I'd like to be selfish and just keep you to myself today at Branksome, but I won't. The rest of the community wants to see you. And I want to thank all of our listeners and everyone who's watching. Thank you for tuning in to our first podcast. I hope that we've made Branksome proud with this first one, and I'm sure we'll just continue to get better and better. Stay tuned for more episodes. You can listen, you can watch, subscribe, share. It's really important to us that we've got great engagement and that we're able to share the incredible expertise that we have here at Branksome Hall with the world. You can write to me at PrincipalED at branksome.on.ca. Tell us what you think. What topics would you like to hear? Or maybe let me know if you've got an idea for who our next guest should be. Maybe you think it's you. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye for now.